Well, hello everyone. This is Barry Jones with SP History, and today we are beginning episode 5 of the Martin Luther King series. And so far, we've covered the government's case in episode 1. Episodes 2 and 3, we talked about William Pepper, his investigation. Episode 4, we talked about the cover-up of William Pepper, the effort by the government and publishers and editors, etc., to blacklist his story and the evidence that he found, his writing. Also, we talked about Judge Joe Brown and the investigation that he conducted during the time that he was the judge overseeing the James Earl Ray appeals process. So that's where we left off. And today we're going to talk about COINTELPRO, which is what I started with. And it's the title of all of my MLK series. As you see, the COINTELPRO gets its man. And this is the FBI operation to discredit the civil rights movement, also the anti-war movement, to infiltrate both movements, to cause violence, to false flag operations, to turn one group against another, and to try to discredit not only the movements themselves, but also the leadership of all the movements, and to essentially splinter the opposition to the government policy of which at that time was the Vietnam War. And any opposition to that war was a target. So we're going to talk about COINTELPRO today and some of the specifics as it relates to Martin Luther King. I've gone over these sources in all the preceding videos, so I'm not going to rehash that, but these are my sources. And in this particular episode, a lot of my material will come from the Scarrow book, The FBI and Martin Luther King Jr., From Solo to Memphis. All right. A lot of what we're going to learn about COINTELPRO happens in the 70s when the Senator Frank Church from Idaho chairs the Select Committee into Intelligence Activities. To understand why this committee came into existence, you need to understand the chronology of what the American people are learning, starting in 63 and 64 with the Warren Commission, which initially a majority of Americans were satisfied with. The conclusions are reached that it was a lone gunman that killed JFK. However, as we got to the end of that decade, that trust started being chipped away at by events such as the Clay Shaw trial down in New Orleans, where even though Jim Garrison lost his case, for the first time, Americans saw the Zapruder film. And that cast immediately into doubt the government narrative that all shots came from behind and above. Just looking at the Zapruder film, piece of evidence the government never thought the American people would see. And then you have the Watergate scandal in the early 70s. And the Watergate hearings were on national television. And for the first time, the American people got an inside view into the machinations of politics and government, etc. And there was a lot of things that were related to Watergate that reached back potentially all the way to the JFK assassination. And there was some hanky panky that the intelligence, but specifically the CIA, was involved in. That when Watergate was all over, senators and congressmen wanted to get to the bottom of all this other stuff that they were learning about, and that was what was going on in the intelligence community. So, as a result of these, first the Warren Commission, and then the Clay Shaw trial, and then the Watergate hearings, we end up with the Church Committee in 1975 to investigate what these, in our name, what these intelligence agencies have been up to. So, again, history does not happen in a vacuum. The reason there is a Church Committee is because there was a Watergate hearing. And of course, included in the findings of the Watergate hearings was a lot of stuff that reached back, as I said, to the JFK assassination. If they had so chosen at that moment, it was such a missed opportunity, the Watergate hearings. They were so zeroed in on Nixon and the Watergate break-in and the dirty tricks of the Nixon committee to reelect the president, the 72 campaign, that they missed the bigger picture. They did succeed in targeting Nixon and his administration and forcing him out. They could have solved the JFK assassination at the same time, because there was all kinds of evidence emerging that reached back to the JFK assassination and said that these intelligence operations, which Watergate was were not isolated incidents. They were part of a continuing pattern. And some of the same people involved in the Watergate break-in were also involved in the JFK assassination. If they had chosen at that point, they could have solved both crimes. They didn't. They kicked the can down the road, like folks in Washington are wont to do. And Frank Church picked up that can in 75, started looking into the intelligence community. He was the chairperson of this committee. Some people call him the last honest man in Congress. There was just a lot of questions after Watergate about what the intelligence community, the CIA, the FBI, had been up to. So that was the purpose of this committee, to get to the bottom of that. And one of the things that they learned, one of the things that emerged during this period, is that the FBI had a counterpart that the CIA was doing during this period. CIA, which is not supposed to operate domestically, but had their own operation called Operation Chaos, which was their equivalent the FBI was doing in COINTELPRO. So our two intelligence agencies were engaged simultaneously in essentially the same thing. They were just coming at it from different angles. So I want to define COINTELPRO and let's go through some of the nuts and bolts of this. During the church hearings, one of the things that Congress learned is that the FBI began this operation called COINTELPRO at the behest of J. Edgar Hoover. COINTELPRO stands for Counterintelligence Program. And its purpose, or to its its documented purpose was to disrupt the Communist Party of the United States. There was a fledgling movement, a Communist Party movement in our country, and J. Edgar Hoover was just obsessed with anything he thought was communist. And so its purpose, as stated in the documents, was to disrupt the Communist Party of the United States. Some people don't realize there still is a Communist Party of the United States. And what Hoover was worried about was that the Communist Party was infiltrating our government, and we were being slowly taken over from within. And so in the 60s, COINTELPRO, though it started and its target was the Communist Party, it was expanded to include the KKK, the Socialist Workers' Party, the Black Panther Party, and the anti-war movement. And what we've been talking about specifically relates back to the Black Panther Party and the anti-war movement. Obviously, the Black Panther Party is involved in civil rights. The anti-war movement is involved in the Vietnam War. From the March on Washington in 63 all the way to his assassination in 68, COINTELPRO had another feature to it, another purpose, and that was to engage in an intense campaign to discredit Martin Luther King. J. Edgar Hoover was eat up with Martin Luther King. He was obsessed with him. He thought he had the potential to become our first Black president. He thought he was fraternizing with communists. He thought he was a communist. He thought the SCLC, the Civil Rights Movement, was communist, and that this was actually a communist plot to infiltrate our government and to take it over. And so the March on Washington in 1963 was such a success for the Civil Rights Movement generally, SCLC, but particularly for Martin Luther King. And that's when he gave his I Have a Dream speech, and it really thrust him on the map, not just with the Black community, but also now with whites who were sympathetic to the civil rights movement. But then when Vietnam broke out shortly thereafter, it became poor whites whose boys were being drafted and sent off to war, who began to engage with Martin Luther King's movement, and his base expanded exponentially. It wasn't just the other side of the tracks who supported him. And now it was people on both sides of the tracks, Black and white, and mostly poor. But there's a lot of poor people in this country, especially in the 60s. So what LBJ or JFK, I'm sorry, I'll get it eventually. What Hoover was paranoid of was that on the heels of the I Have a Dream speech in 1963 at the March on Washington, Martin Luther King was becoming a political candidate. He was sort of transitioning out of the civil rights movement as he had done before. You think about what Montgomery did for him. The bus boycott in Montgomery turned him in from a pastor, a local pastor, into a civil rights icon, a leader. And now the March on Washington was transitioning him yet again into a political candidate, a political leader of Blacks and whites across the board. And of course, in 63, it was about civil rights, but by the time we get to 68, it's going to be about opposing the war. And so his base has slowly expanded from 63 to 68. So he becomes a target. As I mentioned, Hoover was obsessed with anything communist. And his fear was that Martin Luther King was aligning himself with communists. This is a copy of a memo, an FBI memo that talking about his close relationship with Stanley David Levison, who was a longtime secretary of the Communist Party. He was a member of the Communist Party, obviously, helped establish the Communist Party. This guy was, as far as the Communist Party in America was concerned, Stanley David Levison was one of the movers and shakers. And according to FBI informants, he was now a top advisor to Martin Luther King by the time we get to 68. And so you see this memo is dated 1966. So by the time we get to 68, this relationship between Martin Luther King and this very prominent communist was something that J. Edgar Hoover had taken note of and was keeping a close eye on. And the fact that simultaneous to this relationship with this communist, who was his advisor, simultaneous to this, Martin Luther King was becoming a very loud anti-war voice. You can see the math going on in J. Edgar Hoover's head. We're fighting the communists, right, in North Vietnam. At least that's the story America's being told. So here's Martin Luther King opposing the war. That makes him a communist sympathizer, right? And the fact that he has a communist as his close advisor, a well-known communist, somebody that he's been asked many times to disavow and refuses to do it, cements in J. Edgar Hoover's mind this belief that Martin Luther King was a closet communist and was rapidly coming out of that closet. And he didn't care who knew. And in his view, Hoover's view, Martin Luther King might as well have just been part of the Communist Party. So how did FBI and COINTELPRO target Martin Luther King? First of all, they wiretapped his phones and anyone he was discussing with, or talking with. I learned something about this a few years ago when they were talking about the Russiagate scandal and how the FBI got wiretapped. They got warrants to wiretap then candidate Trump's phones. And they had what was called a 2-bump rule. which means not only are they wiretapping his phones, they're bugging his Trump Tower. They have access to his emails, and the two bump rule gives the FBI access to uh, anybody else in his orbit. So if you send an email to Trump, then you are one bump removed from the subject of the search warrant. So everyone in your orbit gets bugged and surveilled as well. And then whoever talks to you, that's the second bump. And they have, it's allowed, the search warrant gave them two bumps. You think about you extrapolate that out, you think about the numbers that would, it's somebody of Donald Trump's notorieties in his position probably knows millions of people, right? Let's just say thousands of people. But if you have a two bump allowance, that means that those thousands turn into hundreds of thousands, turn into millions of people. And if you find anything in those two bumps, that now gives you go get another search warrant on that person, and you can go two bumps from them. You could, in theory, in no time at all, be surveilling the entire country. And it wouldn't take very long. All you have to do is find anything suspicious in an email or a recorded phone conversation, a text message, whatever. You go back with that probable cause, get your search warrant, and now you have two more bumps. And then that's going to yield all this new intelligence. If you find anything suspicious that warrants another warrant based on probable cause, that gives you two more bumps. And where does it stop? That's what COINTELPRO, they didn't have the technology that we have now, but that's what they were doing essentially to Martin Luther King in the 60s. So they wiretapped his phones. They bugged and recorded his hotel rooms in advance. I'll show you here in a minute how that happened, so that they could listen in, even if he wasn't on the phone, to all his conversations in the hotel room, or possibly get a hold of some compromise, some blackmail material. Maybe he's having a woman over to his hotel room or something, and they have bugged it. You've recorded everything that goes on in there, and they can use that against him. They paid informants to spy on him and to infiltrate his organization. They blackmailed him. This was all going on during the lead up to the time that we've been discussing in '68 when he got assassinated. Chuck Knox, a former FBI agent, said, quote, "The FBI would go into these hotels before King and his associates got there, and they'd be let in by the management to bug those rooms and to have the rooms next door nearby where they could listen in to what was going on when King and his associates took those rooms." So this was an all-out assault. Anytime King was going to go to a new city, the agenda was FBI agents were on the move to get to those places, to start to monitor and wiretap and listen to everything that was happening within the confines of those rooms between King and his associates and members of the SCLC. So he is very clear. This is something that Jesse Jackson has referred to numerous times. You hear him talk about the lead up to the assassination. It's one of the first things he talks about is the war that the government had that they knew about. They were aware, and they were trying to take precautions against it. But it was next to impossible to completely insulate yourself from all of the surveillance. Hoover's hope was that they would get damaging information on Martin Luther King or the SCLC or anyone. They weren't just targeting Martin Luther King, by the way. They were going after the Black Panthers, the leaders of the Black Panthers, Malcolm X, Huey Newton, all these people were involved, and not just in the civil rights, but also the anti-war. And remember, the CIA is doing their thing with Operation Chaos as well. So you have the two intelligence agencies, the United States government, surveilling the anti-war folks and the civil rights folks, trying to destroy those. Basically, going back to my word, it's the best word I've ever found to describe what they're doing. They're rat fucking these organizations, these movements. And their hope is that they can leak this damaging info to the press will print this stuff and discredit King, his movements, and the anti-war stuff, the civil rights stuff. The problem that Hoover ran into was in the 60s, the press was not in such a big hurry. They didn't have that gotcha mentality yet. So after Watergate in the 70s, they weren't in a rush to air the dirty laundry of prominent public figures. And case example number one is JFK. I mean, if JFK were president today, can you imagine the social media and the stories that we get from his opponents, his political opponents, about his reckless sexual behavior, or his proclivities, uh, sexual proclivities, or his drug use? Or, I mean, it would have been on the front pages. The press now not only doesn't hide, uh, depending upon who's in the White House, if they agree with them or disagree, sometimes they just make stuff up, whether it's for him or against him. They make stuff up. So we've come a long way as far as the press is concerned. Back in the 60s, the press, I remember doing a lesson with my students to talk about how a lot of Americans never knew Franklin Delano Roosevelt was in a wheelchair 90% of the time, because the press would not photograph him sitting in the wheelchair. They didn't want that image of an American president going out of him being infirm in any way. And so a lot of people just didn't know. Then you get to the 60s, and a lot of people didn't know what Kennedy was doing, his personal foibles and all that. They didn't know, because the press liked Kennedy, they liked Camelot, they liked Jackie, and so they protected him. Okay, and the same thing with Martin Luther King, and the anti-war movement was quickly gaining steam amongst the media elites, the liberal media elites, and they weren't going to print things that were derogatory to the movement. So Hoover's hope, as he's gathering all this info, this compromise he's going to use as blackmail, it's not working as he had hoped, because the press won't print half of it, or even more than that. And so during this period of time when he thought he was going to succeed in discrediting MLK's influence just continued to grow. So it wasn't working. That's my point. It wasn't working. The anti-war movement was growing. The civil rights movement was marching on. And all of COINTELPRO's achievements, so to speak, or its efforts, that and Operation Chaos, were just not working. Just keep that in the back of your mind. I wanted to highlight a couple people in particular. I told you that one of their tactics was to infiltrate, and we've already talked about several infiltrators, right, in prior episodes. Here's a famous one. His name is Ernest Withers. He's the famous photographer, civil rights photographer. He took the I Am a Man photograph, that famous. I've used that photograph in several previous episodes. Turns out he was a paid FBI informant during the time he was also acting as Martin Luther King and the SCLC's official civil rights photographer. And he was doing it because he wasn't making very much money taking pictures, and the FBI lured him with money. He was a paid FBI informant, a spy who infiltrated the movement and went around documenting everything with his camera. There's move my face here. There's a book called A Spy in Canaan, and it's subtitled How the FBI Used a Famous Photographer to Infiltrate the Civil Rights Movement. It's the story of Ernest Withers. Another one is Reverend Billy Kyles. Now, this pertains to Memphis. I mentioned him before. And if you remember, according to Judge Brown, Kyles was compromised as well by the FBI. And he's the guy, admitted, and of course, Jesse Jackson was there and said he did. He led Martin Luther King out onto the balcony, telling him that some of your fans are out there and they want to see you. Remember, it was dinner at Kyle's house that was used as a lure to get Martin Luther King outside that motel room to begin with. They were going to dinner at Kyle's house. And you remember the story, there were all these delays as the Memphis police were trying to clear the field of fire of his security team. Finally, when the security team was all gone, the go-ahead was phoned in to Kyle's wife, and she starts setting the dinner out on the table. And Kyle, instead of them exiting the back of the hotel into the courtyard, the safe, protected area, Kyle's talked Martin Luther King and his entire entourage into going out the front, led him right out onto the balcony, and then snuck back into the room. Once MLK was on the balcony, photographs clearly showed Kyle's missing from the group where that ended up getting fired upon. And in an interview with Dick Gregory in 2016, this was right before Billy, and I told you the story in episode 4, but I'll retell it. Kyle said he ducked back into the room because he, quote, didn't want to get shot. When Gregory asked how he knew there was going to be any shooting, Kyle said, well, I just figured under the circumstances. That's a picture of Dick Gregory down below, Billy Kyle's up above. So here are just a few examples of infiltrators. Now, we already know that Markel McCollum was an FBI informant, and he was the first on the scene. He was a Memphis police officer first on the scene, and he pointed out, became the expert witness, saying that the shots came from the bathroom window, the rooming house. He was FBI. And we already know that Ernest Withers, photographer, was FBI. Now we find out Billy Kyle's was compromised by Hoover. So he was FBI. I mean, so in addition to Frank McCollum, or the guy in charge of the Memphis Police and Fire, who was recently retired from the FBI, and he was on the phone constantly back and forth with Washington with J. Edgar Hoover, running the operation in Memphis on behalf of his former boss. He's former FBI, the Memphis Fire and Police Chief. You can see how the FBI infiltrated all these key positions, these key places into the orbit of Martin Luther King to set up this assassination in Memphis. This is just how they did things. It's how they still do things. They infiltrate these provocateurs into these organizations, into the inner circles. I'll give you a couple examples of some of the things that Martin Luther King was being subjected to. The FBI once mailed King a tape recording made from microphones hidden in these hotel rooms. And there was a note attached suggesting that the recording was going to be released unless, to the public, to smear him, to discredit him, unless King committed suicide. It was right there in the note. The only way you can save yourself is to commit suicide, become a martyr. According to FBI documents examined by the Church Committee, COINTELPRO included the following tactics. These are FBI documents. Okay, this is not me speculating. This is not a third-party witness, a witness saying he heard it from somebody. This is the FBI document saying COINTELPRO will include the following: surveilling, infiltrating, discrediting, and disrupting American political organizations that are considered subversive. And we've already learned that J. Edgar Hoover considered SCLC to be subversive because its leader was fraternizing and had an advisor who was a member of the Communist Party. So it qualifies as subversive. Discrediting targets through psychological warfare, smearing individuals and groups using forged documents and by planting false reports in the media, harassment, wrongful imprisonment, illegal violence, and assassination. So COINTELPRO, I've heard from people in the past, well, COINTELPRO was, it was a controversial program, but they didn't kill anybody. Oh yeah? It says right here in our documents that that's part of the program. And during the time, it didn't shut down until 71. Martin Luther King was assassinated in 68. He wasn't the only one. How about Fred Hampton? Fred Hampton was the founder of the Chicago chapter of the Black Panther Party, another group specifically targeted, we saw in the documents, by COINTELPRO. he formed what was called the Rainbow Coalition. This was an alliance of different ethnic groups. You had African Americans, Puerto Ricans, even poor whites, in a non-aggression pact among gang members, was trying to bring peace to the city of Chicago. And he was identified by the FBI as a, quote, radical threat, according to their own documents. And so they turned Hampton's bodyguard, and he became an FBI agent slash provocateur, an infiltrator, his bodyguard. Just like Thane Eugene Caesar escorting Robbie Kennedy to his death, right? Here is William O'Neill, just like Billy Kyle's escorting Martin Luther King to his death. Here we have William O'Neill on the inner circle, is now part of the security detail around Fred Hampton. He's working for the FBI. And he admitted that he is the one who delivered an apartment floor plan to the FBI with an X marking where Hampton slept in his bed. There was a planned FBI raid. The FBI wanted to know, where is the bed, in which room is the bed, and where is the bed that Fred Hampton will be sleeping in. And it was William O'Neill who delivered him up on December 4, 1969. This is, about a year and a half after Martin Luther King was assassinated. They shot and killed Fred Hampton. The ballistics evidence showed that most of the bullets during the raid were aimed at Hampton's bedroom. In other words, they broke into this apartment, 5 or 6 rooms, but they're all shooting at the bedroom, in the place where the X had marked the spot where the bed was. Over 100 rounds fired by Chicago police and FBI. Hampton was killed sleeping in his bed. And this was part of COINTELPRO. It says so in their own documents. So this is a short lesson today, a short episode. I just want to talk about COINTELPRO briefly. If you want to know more about COINTELPRO and its purpose and thing, it might do you good to go back to my RFK series and listen to my Operation Chaos episode, because that's the CIA version, what they were doing. We were both engaged in basically the same effort. So we've been talking about the FBI since the beginning of this case and how intricately it was involved in the setup of the Patsy, setup of the assassination, setup of the Memphis logistics and the scene. And they infiltrated the invaders with one of theirs to shame him into moving from the Rivermont down to the Lorraine. I mean, nothing was left to chance. Everybody had a job to do. And in the end, you had 20, 25 people involved in this, each doing their own little job. No one knew the whole picture except the FBI. And in the end, they achieved one of the goals of COINTELPRO, which was, when all the other things don't work, which they weren't working, from 63 to 68, all that was happening was Martin Luther King was becoming a bigger name, a bigger force, a louder voice, a more influential voice. He was becoming politically stronger. He was becoming an icon, a walking, talking icon. And so every attempt to discredit him had failed. And when you run out of bullets, metaphorically speaking, then the last resort is assassination. And so that's what the FBI chose. Hoover chose by 66. Okay, we have failed. And so we're going to have to take him out. And so then the effort is to set up the Patsy, find a Patsy first, somebody out of the Missouri prison system that'll fit that psychological profile of Patsy. So we went to Missouri, talked to the commissioner, went to the warden, arranged the escape. The military got involved, handing out an alias, sending sniper teams and photographic teams. Hoover sent Clyde Tolson to Memphis to meet with the Dixie Mafia family, the Adkins family, and Frank McCollum, his guy on the ground there in Memphis, started setting it up so that enticing Martin Luther King to come to Memphis and start this poor people's march and march with the garbage workers in their strike. I mean, you just see all the pieces coming together. Every piece. And they had every base covered, up to and including, even if he doesn't die, you send him to the hospital that has the doctor who is the family doctor of the Dixie Mafia family, and he'll take care of it. And then afterwards, You've set up the patsy beautifully. You make the arrest. You drop the bundle with his gun. You have a lawyer assigned to him that's going to, under a pretext, tell his client, listen, you're going to have to plead guilty. I'm in poor health. I can't represent you. Just plead guilty for now. Take your 99-year sentence, and then you can have a retrial later. Here's $500 to help you buy a new lawyer. I mean, every base covered. And it wasn't until Dr. William Pepper came along, Judge Joe Brown came along, that they began investigating and trying to get to the truth of this. If it hadn't been for them, I don't know to this day if we'd know the truth. Then that jives with what we learned during the Church Commission and what was going on there with the FBI being a rogue agency, launching this COINTELPRO surveillance operation against American citizens, including Martin Luther King. And you realize how intricately this plan was woven together. And by the time we get to 99, the evidence is so overwhelming that two courts of law separate from one another. The criminal court, Judge Joe Brown, was prepared to rule that James Earl Ray was innocent, so they took him off the case. As far as the civil case was concerned, the jury heard the evidence and in 59 minutes decided that it wasn't James Earl Ray. It was a bit player, Lloyd Jowers. But most importantly, it was a conspiracy of officers of the United States government, the state of Tennessee, and the city of Memphis. That was your verdict by the time we got to 99. But it was because of the dogged pursuit of the truth by two men in particular, Dr. William Pepper and Judge Joe Brown. So that's episode 5. And episode 6, I will now bring all of these different JFK, RFK, and MLK assassinations, elements of them together, and we will look at the common traits of each one so you can see the pattern. It's helpful sometimes to just lay it out on black and white, in this case, a PowerPoint presentation, where you can just methodically work through 20 or so cases where these 3 separate assassinations were actually handled exactly the same. Everything's the same. So that'll be episode 6. Until then, hope everybody has a great day. God bless. Thank you.